What would you do if the simple act of sitting in the seat you paid for turned into a nightmare? Imagine being just 11 years old, quietly holding your boarding pass, when a flight attendant tells you that you don't belong. Imagine the sting of a hand striking your face, the sound of your mother's letter tearing in half, the humiliation of strangers watching while your dignity is ripped away. But what if that child was not ordinary? What if his silence, his refusal to move, and his calm strength exposed something far larger than one cruel act? What if, with a single hidden signal from his watch, he set into motion a chain of events that would shake the airline industry, reach Congress, and force a nation to confront the question, who truly belongs in the skies tonight? We uncover the story of Julian Carter, the boy in 2A, whose quiet defiance became a roar for justice, a story of pain, power, and the dignity no one can take away. Before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because this is a journey you won't want to miss. The first-class cabin of Horizon Atlantic Flight 317 hummed with a low, steady calm. The kind of calm that made the soft clink of champagne glasses sound louder than it was. The kind of calm that let you hear the faint shuffle of leather shoes on the carpeted aisle. The air smelled faintly of citrus polish and new upholstery. For most passengers, it was a small luxury, a temporary escape from the world outside. But for one boy in seat 2A, it felt more like a stage with every eye watching. Julian Carter sat with his back straight, hands folded neatly in his lap. 11 years old, dressed in a navy blazer that fit just right, a crisp white shirt, and shoes polished until they caught the light. His dark eyes studied the pattern of tiny dots on the bulkhead in front of him, trying to look calm, though inside his chest his heart drummed. He had been taught to carry himself with composure, to never let the world see him flinch. His father called it dignity. His mother called it quiet strength. The boarding door was still open, and passengers trickled in. Flight attendants moved with rehearsed efficiency, arranging bags, pouring water, checking seatbelts. Then came the pause, the moment that changed everything. "Excuse me." A woman's voice, firm, clipped, and carrying that slight edge of suspicion that didn't need words to explain. Megan Rowe, senior flight attendant, leaned over Julian's seat. Her smile was tight, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Honey, are you sure this is your seat?" Her eyes flicked to his boarding pass resting on the console beside him. Then, back to his face. A beat of silence. "Where are your parents?" Julian swallowed. His throat felt dry. "My father's meeting me in New York. My mother dropped me at security. I'm traveling alone." A murmur rose from behind someone adjusting luggage, someone else sighing impatiently. Megan's smile faded. She plucked the boarding pass off the console, holding it like it might bite her. She studied it longer than necessary. Passengers nearby noticed. A man in 2C glanced over his newspaper. A woman across the aisle pulled her headphones off one ear. The air thickened with curiosity, the way it does when tension creeps in, uninvited. "This is first class," Megan said at last, as if Julian hadn't understood. "These tickets cost thousands of dollars. Are you absolutely certain this isn't a mistake?" The words stung more than he expected. Julian's mother had pressed the boarding pass into his hand at the gate with a quiet reminder, "Keep your chin high, no matter what." He wanted to believe that would be enough. "I'm certain," Julian said, his voice steady but soft. Megan's brow furrowed. She bent closer, invading his space. "I need you to stand up. Now. This seat may not belong to you." Julian hesitated. He could feel every pair of eyes now. His palms dampened against his lap. 1,000 thoughts flashed if he argued. Would they drag him out if he obeyed? Would that mean surrendering something more than a seat? And then it happened. Megan's hand darted out, not just to tug at the pass, not just to gesture. Her open palm landed hard against his cheek. A sharp crack, louder than anyone expected, cut through the cabin's hush. Julian's head jerked sideways. The sting bloomed across his skin. His breath caught. For a moment, the entire world froze. Glasses stopped clinking. Bags stopped rustling. The engines outside rumbled, indifferent, while inside 30 pairs of eyes widened in shock. The silence after the slap was heavier than the sound itself. Julian didn't cry. He didn't shout. His small fingers curled around the armrest until his knuckles whitened, but he stayed still. His father's words echoed. Never let them see you broken. His mother's voice layered softly on top. You are worthy of every space you step into. Somewhere behind him, a passenger gasped. A phone lifted discreetly. Camera already recording. Another voice whispered, Did she just hit that kid? Megan straightened, cheeks flushed, her composure slipping. I didn't mean she began, but the words fell flat. Everyone had seen, everyone had heard. Julian blinked. Once, twice, his eyes focusing on the bulkhead again. Inside, a storm churned. Anger wanted to rise. Fear clawed at his chest. Humiliation pressed against his rib, but he kept it all behind a calm mask. He knew what this was. He had seen looks like hers before, felt that subtle doubt before. Only this time, it had crossed a line in front of witnesses. The intercom chimed softly overhead, calling another crew member to the galley. The sound felt surreal, like background music to something no one should ignore. In the next row, a woman whispered to her husband, Why would she hit him? He's just a child. The man didn't answer. His phone was already angled discreetly, camera light blinking red. Julian sat in silence, pulse racing. His cheek throbbed. His dignity burned brighter. He thought of the small black watch clasped on his wrist, a birthday gift from his father. Its face gleamed faintly under the cabin lights. Hidden behind the simple design was a function he had hoped never to use. 3 taps, then 2, then 1. An alert would pulse quietly across secure channels, but not yet. He wasn't ready. He needed to hold steady. He needed to decide if this moment required it. He drew in a slow breath, the way his father had taught him before every public event, before every room that doubted he belonged. Breathe in your worth, Darius Carter always said. Exhale the noise. Julian breathed and waited. The slap still echoed in the cabin, but now it echoed in the conscience of every witness too, and the question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. What happens next? The cabin lights dimmed slightly as boarding continued. Julian Carter sat still in seat 2A, his cheek still warm from the sting of Megan Rowe's hand. The hush that had followed the slap was beginning to shift into a low ripple of whispers. Some passengers avoided looking at him, staring instead at their phones or the glossy airline magazine in their laps. Others stole glances, the kind that held both sympathy and unease, as though they wanted to intervene but feared what it might cost them. Julian did not move. He kept his hands folded neatly, his posture straight. Inside, his mind worked quickly, replaying every detail. His mother had prepared him for moments of doubt and prejudice. She had not prepared him for being struck in front of strangers who did nothing more than whisper. He told himself to stay calm, to remember the lessons his father had repeated so often. Dignity is not what they give you. It is what you hold when they try to take it away. Through the open boarding door, more passengers streamed in, carrying leather bags, designer coats, and duty-free purchases. They glanced at Julian as they passed, some with curiosity, others with suspicion, as if wondering whether he belonged among them. The scent of expensive perfume and cologne mixed with the faint aroma of reheated bread from the galley. The hum of the engines outside made the cabin vibrate just slightly, a reminder that soon they would be sealed together for hours, high above the ground. Julian's eyes dropped to the watch on his wrist. The sleek black band hugged his skin, a gift from his father just 6 months earlier. It was more than a timepiece. It was a symbol of trust, of responsibility, and, hidden beneath the elegant design, a safeguard. 3 taps, then 2, then 1. The sequence was simple, but irreversible. His father's team would know. Help would come. He had not pressed it yet. He wanted to believe this could be resolved without calling upon power that did not belong to an ordinary child. He wanted to stand on his own. Megan Rowe returned, her lips pressed tight, her eyes sharper now. She still held his boarding pass between 2 fingers. "I am checking this with the supervisor," she said curtly, her voice low enough for only those nearest to hear. She did not meet his eyes as she turned and strode down the aisle. Julian exhaled slowly, his small shoulders relaxing just slightly. The murmurs behind him grew louder. A man in his 50s, seated in 2C, cleared his throat. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, though he did not say more. Across the aisle, a young woman put her phone on her tray table and angled the camera toward Julian's seat, pretending to scroll but clearly recording. Julian noticed. He felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of him was grateful that someone might capture the truth. Another part of him felt exposed, as though his humiliation was now content for the world to dissect. He wondered what his father would say. Would he tell him to be thankful for witnesses, or would he remind him that dignity should never depend on strangers with cameras? His cheek still throbbed. He touched it lightly with his fingertips, the sting reminding him that this was not just about belonging in first class. This was about something deeper. A memory surfaced, unbidden. He was 6 years old, sitting at the edge of his father's office while Darius Carter held a meeting with executives. Julian had watched quietly, fascinated by the way his father commanded the room without ever raising his voice. When the meeting ended, Darius had knelt beside him and said, "Power is not loud. Julian, power is the calm in the storm, the steady voice when others shout. Remember that now." In seat 2A, Julian tried to embody that calm. His pulse raced, his mind spun, but his voice, if he chose to use it, would remain steady. Megan returned with another crew member, a younger flight attendant whose eyes darted nervously between Julian and the growing number of passengers settling in. Megan handed her the boarding pass, whispering something sharp that Julian could not hear. The younger attendant looked uneasy. She nodded but did not approach Julian. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing a slight delay as final checks were completed. The sound was steady, professional, almost soothing. But for Julian, it felt like background noise to a drama that was only beginning. Passengers shuffled, buckling seatbelts, adjusting pillows. Yet the energy in the cabin was different now. Everyone had seen the slap. No one could pretend otherwise. The silence that followed Megan's return was not calm, but charged, like the air before a storm. Julian glanced out the window. The tarmac stretched wide under fading daylight. Baggage carts moved like ants, and fuel trucks glided past with quiet efficiency. Somewhere beyond the airport, the city spread out, oblivious to the small injustice that had just taken place inside this cabin. He wondered if anyone outside would ever know, or if this moment would vanish into silence like so many others. The young woman across the aisle caught his eye. She gave the faintest nod, as if to say, I saw. I will not forget." That small gesture warmed him, though he kept his expression neutral. Inside, the struggle deepened. Should he press the watch now? Should he wait? Let events unfold? His father would want to protect him, but Julian did not want to appear weak, to look as though he could not stand on his own. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, replaying his mother's words as she hugged him at the gate. "You are more than they can see. Remember that when the world doubts you." The words steadied him. The engines whirred louder. The crew prepared for pushback. Megan walked past again, avoiding his gaze, her posture stiff. Julian felt the weight of the entire cabin pressing down on him, every whisper, every glance, every unspoken question. Who is this boy, and why is he here? He kept his silence. His dignity was intact, even if his cheek still burned. The stage was set. The flight had not even left the ground, and already a storm was gathering. Julian knew the night would not end quietly. The boarding door closed with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the first-class cabin. The sound usually signaled the beginning of safety and routine, but tonight it felt like the ceiling of a cage. Julian Carter sat in seat 2A, posture steady but heart racing, as though the air had grown tighter with every breath. Megan Rowe lingered near the galley, arms folded, whispering with another attendant. Julian could not hear the words, but he did not need to. He knew that whispers often carried sharper blades than shouts. From the corner of his eye he saw glances darting his way, fleeting yet unmistakable. He had been in enough rooms to recognize the look, the same one that asked silently, "Do you belong here?" The younger attendant returned briefly, kneeling at the side of the man in 2C. Julian caught fragments of the conversation. Something about checking records, something about passenger verification. The man frowned, nodded, then glanced at Julian with a mixture of pity and discomfort, as if he wanted to say something but chose silence instead. Julian's throat tightened. His fingers toyed with the smooth edge of his watch, brushing against the cool glass face. The coded sequence of taps lingered at the front of his mind, yet still he resisted. To press it now would feel like surrender, as though admitting he could not withstand even the first storm. He wanted to believe he could. He wanted to prove to himself that he was more than the name he carried. The engines hummed louder, preparing for taxi. Megan returned, standing tall beside his seat, her smile replaced by a look of icy control. "Julian, is it I need to verify your ticket with the supervisor? Until then, you'll have to remain standing." The words struck like a quiet blow. He looked up at her, calm but firm. "This is my seat. I'm staying." Her eyes narrowed. "You can't refuse crew instructions." Whispers rustled through the cabin again. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, her phone angled toward the confrontation, her screen glowing faintly. Someone behind Julian coughed, the sound sharp in the tense air. Julian drew in a breath. He remembered his father's lessons when pressed. Speak only with clarity and restraint. "I am not refusing," he said evenly. "I am sitting in the seat assigned to me." Megan's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned abruptly, marching down the aisle. The younger attendant trailed behind her, hesitant, eyes flicking nervously toward Julian as if apologizing silently for something she could not change. Julian's chest felt tight. The weight of eyes pressed against him from all sides, not with open hostility but with something colder distance. No one rose, no one spoke aloud, no one challenged Megan's behavior. They observed, they whispered, they documented quietly on their phones, but they did not act. The isolation was heavier than the slap had been. He turned his gaze toward the window. The tarmac rolled by slowly as the aircraft began to push back from the gate. Trucks moved beneath sodium lights, their orange beacons flashing like warning signs in the night. The world outside seemed oblivious to the storm inside this cabin. Julian's thoughts spun. Should he have spoken louder? Should he have demanded respect instead of waiting silently? He remembered his mother's words that morning at the airport, her voice soft but steady. "You are more than they can see. Do not let them shrink you." But here, in this polished cabin where every seat cost more than some people earned in a month, he felt himself shrinking under the collective silence of strangers. A voice interrupted his thoughts. The man in 2C leaned slightly toward him, speaking in a low tone. "Kid, don't take it personally. She's just doing her job." Julian turned his head, meeting the man's gaze. His voice, though quiet, carried a weight that surprised even him. "Her job is not to hit children." The man looked away quickly, returning to his newspaper with a flush on his cheeks. The words hung in the air. Undeniable. Too sharp to dismiss. Julian's heart pounded. For the first time he had spoken aloud in defiance, not just in defense. He wondered if it was enough. The seatbelt signs chimed. Megan reappeared with a taller man in a gray vest and lanyard, his badge glinting under the cabin lights. Thomas Grant, the supervisor. His face was stern, his eyes cool as he approached Julian's seat. "Sir," Thomas said, addressing Julian, though his tone suggested otherwise, "we've had a report of a possible discrepancy with your ticket. We'll need to verify your travel status before departure." Julian stayed seated, his voice steady, though his chest ached. "My ticket is valid. My seat is 2A. You can verify without moving me." Thomas frowned. Megan hovered behind him, satisfaction flickering across her face. Passengers craned their necks, eager for resolution. Julian's mind screamed with indecision. Should he tap the watch now, call for the silent network his father had promised would protect him? Or should he wait, endure, prove he could hold his ground alone? The struggle tore at him. He glanced at the woman across the aisle, the one who had been recording. Her eyes met his, unwavering. She gave a small nod. It was not rescue, but it was recognition. Julian's hand dropped from the watch. Not yet. Thomas sighed, muttering into his radio. "We'll hold departure until this is sorted." The aircraft slowed, its pushback halted. A murmur spread through the cabin, irritation mixing with curiosity. People wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Julian sat motionless, feeling the weight of judgment press harder. Isolation wrapped around him like a cloak. He was visible to everyone, yet unseen for who he truly was. Inside, he whispered to himself the words he had learned long ago. "You are not less. You are not small. You belong." The plane idled on the tarmac. The tension had only begun to build, and Julian knew this was only the first test of many to come. The engines thrummed with anticipation, a low vibration that pulsed through the cabin walls. Passengers settled into their seats with restless energy, but the atmosphere was far from ordinary. The tension around seat 2A had spread like an invisible current. Conversations hushed, eyes lingered too long, and even the rustle of magazines seemed louder than usual. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Julian Carter remained seated, his back pressed against the leather cushion, his hands still folded neatly. He tried to focus on the hum of the engines, the faint scent of coffee drifting from the galley, anything that might anchor him against the storm gathering in front of him. Thomas Grant, the supervisor, loomed nearby with his radio clipped to his vest. Megan Rowe hovered close behind, arms crossed tightly, her lips pursed as if she had already decided how this would end. The power dynamics of the cabin were tilting, and Julian could feel himself at the center of it, though he was only a boy. Thomas spoke with professional detachment. "Julian, I need you to stand. We are going to reassign your seat temporarily until this matter is resolved. The words felt like a blow, but Julian forced himself to stay calm. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Do not surrender ground that is rightfully yours. Speak clearly, without fear. This is my assigned seat, Julian said, his voice steady, though his palms trembled against his knees. I will not move. Megan's eyes flashed with irritation. You are obstructing procedures. Either you stand, or we will have to remove you from this cabin. The murmurs around them swelled. A man in the back row muttered something about delays. A woman whispered sharply to her husband, He's just a child. Why are they pressing him like this? Julian's chest ached with the weight of all the eyes on him. Inside his mind, a battle raged. Should he press the watch now? The 3 taps that would summon help? Or would that mean he had failed to hold his ground? He could almost hear his mother's voice. You are more than they can see. You do not have to prove your worth. He lifted his chin, meeting Megan's glare head on. I am not leaving this seat. My ticket is valid. The silence that followed was heavier than the engines. Megan's patience snapped. In a swift motion she leaned forward, snatching the folded letter that his mother had tucked into the side pocket of his backpack. It was a simple letter, written in blue ink on cream paper, with a few gentle reminders about the trip. Hold your head high. Call me when you land. Remember who you are. Megan unfolded it quickly, her eyes scanning the handwriting with disdain. This is not proof of anything, she said sharply, and in one motion she tore the letter in half. The sound of paper ripping was like a scream in Julian's ears. She let the torn pieces flutter onto the floor. Something inside Julian twisted. The slap earlier had burned his skin, but this act cut deeper. It was not just an attack on him, but on the words of his mother, the love she had placed in every line. He felt his throat tighten, tears threatening, but he clenched his jaw. He would not give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. A gasp rippled through the cabin. The young woman across the aisle, phone in hand, whispered fiercely, Did she just rip that letter? Her recording caught every second. Another passenger leaned forward, disbelief on his face. That's too far. This is out of line. Julian's heart hammered. His fingers brushed against the watch. He hesitated for one final breath, then pressed tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, pause, tap. The sequence was complete. A silent signal pulsed outward, invisible yet powerful, like a stone dropped into still water. He sat back, steadying his breath. No one around him knew what he had done, but Julian did. Help was on its way. Megan, oblivious, placed her hands on her hips. You will come with us now, she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Julian remained still. No. The word was simple, but it carried more weight than his small frame should have been able to hold. The cabin erupted into a murmur of voices. Some passengers spoke up for him, others groaned about delays. But the tide of opinion was shifting. Too many had seen the slap. Too many had witnessed the letter torn apart. The narrative was no longer under Megan's control. Thomas raised his radio, speaking quickly to the flight deck. The aircraft slowed on the tarmac, coming to a halt. Passengers exchanged looks, realizing this was no ordinary delay. The captain's voice soon came over the intercom. Calm, yet firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a situation that requires further attention. Please remain seated. Julian closed his eyes. He felt the vibration of the engines fade slightly as the plane idled. He imagined his father in some distant boardroom, phone buzzing with an alert, eyes narrowing as he realized his son had called for help. He imagined the steps already being set in motion, unseen but unstoppable. Inside. His thoughts wavered. Part of him felt relief that he had pressed the watch. Another part ached with guilt, as though he had betrayed his own desire to handle this alone. Was he strong enough on his own, or did strength sometimes mean knowing when to call for help? His cheek still burned, his heart still ached for the shredded letter, but his spirit remained unbroken. Megan leaned closer, her tone icy. "You don't understand. Child, you don't belong here." Julian opened his eyes, his gaze steady. "Yes, I do." The words carried through the cabin, louder than they should have been, echoing in the silence that followed. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, caught between complicity and conscience. The woman across the aisle whispered, "That boy is braver than all of us." Julian sat taller, his breath even. For the first time, he felt the balance of power shift slightly. He had been struck, humiliated, stripped of a letter that meant the world to him. But he had not been moved from his seat. He had not surrendered. The cabin lights flickered softly. Outside, the aircraft stood still on the tarmac, waiting. Inside, the breaking point had come, and Julian Carter, just 11 years old, had chosen his line in the sand. The cabin of Horizon Atlantic Flight 317 had fallen into a strange half-silence. It was not the comfortable quiet of travelers preparing for a long flight, but a fragile hush stretched thin over the weight of what had just happened. The engines hummed as the aircraft idled on the tarmac, but inside the walls of first class, time itself seemed to pause. Julian Carter sat rooted in 2A, his cheek still marked faintly from the earlier slap. The memory of his mother's letter shredded on the floor near his shoes. The sting of those moments lingered. But something else had begun to rise inside him, something steadier than anger. He remembered being 9 years old, standing on a stage at his school recital, his legs trembling as he faced the crowd. His father had been in the front row that night, watching with quiet pride. Julian had stumbled over his lines, panic rising in his chest, until his father had simply mouthed one word: "Breathe." Julian had taken a breath, found his center, and spoken again. That night, he had learned that silence could be power, not weakness. Now, surrounded by skeptical eyes and the oppressive presence of Megan Rowe and Thomas Grant, Julian clung to that lesson. He did not shout. He did not argue. He sat with dignity, his hands still in his lap, his gaze fixed forward as if daring the cabin to measure him against their doubts. The woman across the aisle kept her phone raised discreetly, recording. Her eyes flicked to Julian every few moments, steady with unspoken support. He wondered if her recording would capture not just the violence and the torn letter, but also his refusal to move, his quiet defiance. Inside, his thoughts were anything but quiet. A storm churned. He replayed the slap, the humiliation, the disbelief in Megan's voice when she told him he did not belong. He felt the hot edge of fear that maybe she was right, that maybe without his father's name behind him, he would always be treated as less. Yet alongside that fear rose something else, a steady drumbeat of determination. Do not surrender ground that is yours. His father's words anchored him like a weight at the center of a storm. Megan's voice cut through the air again. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Stand up." Julian did not answer. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "This is a security matter. We need compliance." Still, Julian sat silent. His breathing was calm, deliberate. Each inhale and exhale measured. His small frame radiated a composure that unsettled those around him. Passengers whispered to one another, unsure how to process the sight of a boy refusing to be broken, even under the authority of adults in uniform. The silence itself became a weapon. The more Julian refused to speak, the more their demands echoed hollow in the cabin. Megan grew agitated, her voice rising. "Do you hear me? You cannot sit there without proof." Julian finally lifted his eyes to hers. His voice, when it came, was low but clear. "My proof is this seat. My ticket put me here. I will not move." The words were simple, yet they carried an authority that surprised everyone, including Julian himself. He could feel the shift in the cabin. The murmurs behind him changed, tinged now with admiration. Someone whispered, "That boy has courage." Another passenger muttered, "Leave him alone already." Julian's heart pounded, but he held the mask of calm. He thought again of the watch on his wrist, the signal already sent. Help was coming, though no one else knew it yet. He wondered how long it would take, how far the situation would go before someone stepped in. The intercom crackled. "Cabin crew, please remain at your stations. All passengers remain seated." The captain's voice was calm, but layered with urgency. The engines stayed at idle, the plane unmoving. Julian imagined the flurry of calls being made beyond these walls. His father's phone buzzing in some skyscraper office, a security team already rerouting messages, perhaps even government officials being notified, all because he had pressed a few taps on a watch. The thought should have comforted him, yet it left him with unease. He wanted to be strong on his own, not because of who his father was. The question nagged him, would anyone defend him if he were just another child? The woman across the aisle seemed to sense his thoughts. She lowered her phone for a moment and leaned closer, her voice gentle. "You're doing the right thing. Don't let them scare you." Julian gave the faintest nod. Megan bristled at the sight, snapping, "Ma'am, please stop interfering." The woman held her ground. "I'm not interfering. I'm witnessing. That's what decent people do." Her words landed like a crack of thunder. For the first time, another adult had spoken up openly in Julian's defense. A ripple moved through the cabin. Heads turned. Expressions shifted. Some looked emboldened, others nervous, but the spell of silence had been broken. Julian felt a warmth in his chest. He was not completely alone. Thomas rubbed his temple, his patience fraying. "We're contacting airport security. We can't continue until this is resolved." Julian's gaze fell to the scraps of his mother's letter still scattered on the floor. He longed to reach down, to hold them, to piece them back together, but he kept his hands in his lap. Picking them up would feel like admitting loss. Leaving them there was its own statement. His inner voice spoke again, quieter now, steadier. "You belong. No one can take that truth away." Minutes stretched long. The cabin remained tense, the air thick with anticipation. Some passengers began to mutter about missed connections, but their annoyance was overshadowed by the weight of what they had seen. The slap, the torn letter, the boy who refused to stand. Julian closed his eyes briefly, centering himself in silence. He pictured his mother's face at the gate, her eyes bright with both worry and pride. He pictured his father's calm expression, the way he always seemed to know what to do even under pressure. He tried to borrow that steadiness now. When he opened his eyes, he sat taller. He was not just a child in a seat. He was a statement, a quiet force against humiliation, a reminder that dignity does not require permission. The cabin doors remained sealed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Julian's silence had become strength, and the witnesses around him were no longer neutral. They were watching closely, waiting for justice to arrive. Julian's heartbeat slowed. The fear had not vanished, but it no longer ruled him. He sat in 2A, calm and resolute, a boy holding his ground against a system that wanted to push him aside. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The aircraft had not moved for 10 minutes. The engines still hummed at idle, a low vibration threading through the cabin. But the feeling inside was not one of preparation for flight. It was the tight, breathless air of waiting for something inevitable. Julian Carter stayed in 2A, back straight, hands folded, his body still but his mind in motion. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Megan Rowe stood just a few feet away, her posture rigid, her jaw clenched. She was not simply following procedure now. She was determined to win. Thomas Grant paced once along the aisle, murmuring into his radio. "We need ground intervention," he said quietly, but enough for those nearby to hear. Passengers stirred uneasily. The murmurs grew louder, some people whispering their support for Julian, others grumbling about the delay. The divide in the cabin mirrored the divide in the world outside. Some were willing to see injustice, others only inconvenience. Julian's heart raced, but his face remained calm. The watch on his wrist had already sent its message. He could almost imagine invisible gears turning far beyond this plane, powerful voices beginning to stir. But here, inside this cabin, he was still just a boy accused of not belonging. Megan leaned closer, her voice low and sharp. "You could end this now. Stand up, and this will all be over." Julian met her eyes. No. The single word was quiet, but it carried through the cabin like a spark. A man in row 3 muttered, "He's right." Another passenger whispered, "This is going too far." The woman across the aisle raised her phone higher, no longer pretending to scroll. Her voice was steady. "I am recording everything. Everyone can see what is happening." Megan spun toward her, anger flashing. "You are not allowed to record, crew." The woman did not flinch. "I am allowed to record an assault on a child." Gasps and murmurs rippled again. Megan's authority was slipping, thread by thread. Then it happened. The tension that had been building snapped in a single moment. Megan's hand shot out once more, aiming to seize Julian by the arm and pull him from the seat. Julian flinched, instinct telling him to brace for pain. The sharp sound of her palm striking his cheek a second time cracked through the cabin. This time, the silence that followed was not passive. It was electric. Passengers cried out in disbelief. Someone shouted, "That's enough." Another voice rose. She hit him again. "Call the police." Julian's cheek burned, his vision blurring for a moment. He clutched the armrest, grounding himself, forcing his breath to remain steady. He would not cry. He would not give her the victory of seeing him crumble. The woman across the aisle stood halfway, her phone still recording. Her voice rang out clear. "She just assaulted him. Everyone here saw it. You cannot deny this." Megan froze, realizing too late the weight of what she had done. The cabin had turned against her. The passengers were no longer silent observers. They were witnesses, and their outrage was undeniable. Thomas pressed his radio urgently. Immediate assistance required. "Bring security to the aircraft." The plane shuddered slightly as the engines wound down further, signaling a halt to all preparations. The aircraft was going nowhere until this was resolved. Julian sat still, his cheek throbbing, but his eyes steady. The second slap had hurt more, not just physically, but deeper, cutting at the core of who he was. Yet as he looked around the cabin and saw people rising in his defense, he felt something shift. His silence had sparked something. His refusal to yield had given others courage. A man in row 4 stood, raising his voice. "I have children. If anyone did that to them, I would want someone to speak up. This is unacceptable." Another passenger added, "I saw everything. I'll testify if needed." The cabin had transformed. Where once Julian had felt isolated, now voices rose for him. Megan's authority was crumbling, her posture rigid, but her eyes betraying uncertainty. The intercom chimed, and the captain's voice returned, firmer now. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain calm. Law enforcement will be boarding shortly." The announcement sent a ripple through the cabin. People sat straighter, some pulling out their phones, others whispering furiously. They knew they were part of a moment that would not remain inside this plane. Julian closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. The sting on his cheek reminded him of the cruelty he had endured, but the voices around him reminded him that he was not alone. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that justice might come, not just because of who his father was, but because strangers had chosen to stand. Minutes later, the cabin door opened again. The heavy boots of 2 airport security officers sounded against the aisle carpet. Officer Delgado led the way, his expression unreadable, followed by Officer Riley, who scanned the tense faces around her. Thomas stepped forward quickly, gesturing toward Megan. "We have a situation with this passenger," he began, but voices interrupted him. "Not the passenger," someone shouted. "The flight attendant hit him. She assaulted the boy," another added. Phones were raised everywhere now, cameras recording openly. The truth was captured in dozens of angles, dozens of voices. There would be no hiding it. Officer Delgado held up a hand for silence. His eyes landed on Julian first, the small boy sitting quietly, cheek red, eyes calm. Then he looked to Megan, whose posture had shifted from control to panic. "What happened here?" Delgado asked, his voice low but commanding. The woman across the aisle stepped forward without hesitation, phone still in hand. "I have it all recorded." She slapped him. Twice. She tore his letter apart. She tried to drag him from his seat. Delgado nodded slowly. "We will review all evidence. Everyone remained seated." Julian's heart thudded. He knew this was not the end, only another beginning. Yet he felt a quiet strength in his chest. He had endured the storm. He had not broken. And now, with the eyes of the cabin and the cameras of passengers, the truth was out. Megan opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but the weight of the witnesses silenced her. Thomas shifted uneasily, his authority unraveling with hers. Julian touched the watch on his wrist again, though this time not to signal. He only felt the smooth surface, a reminder that he had chosen his moment wisely. Help was here. The tide was turning. The officers spoke quietly to Thomas, then motioned for Megan to step aside. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the cabin, but the voices of passengers rose again, demanding accountability. At last, she moved reluctantly toward the aisle, her authority stripped away. Julian sat still, breathing slowly, his silence once again louder than words. He had faced humiliation, violence, and disbelief, but he had not surrendered. And now, as the cabin shifted decisively in his favor, he knew that this was not just about him. It was about every child, every passenger, every person told they did not belong. The aircraft remained on the ground, but turbulence had already shaken its walls. The cabin was no longer a place of quiet luxury. It had become a courtroom, its walls trembling with the weight of witnesses and the heavy silence of judgment. The officers who had boarded stood tall, scanning the first-class rows, their presence adding a new layer of gravity to the scene. Julian Carter sat still in 2A, his small frame anchored like a stone in a rushing current. The redness on his cheek had faded to a dull glow, but the sting remained. He folded his hands tighter, the steady calm in his posture contrasting with the chaos swirling around him. Officer Delgado crouched slightly to Julian's level. His voice was steady but gentle. "Son, can you tell me what happened here?" Julian hesitated. His father had taught him to choose words carefully, never to speak out of anger, but to let truth carry its own weight. He drew a breath and spoke clearly. "She hit me. Twice. She tore my letter from my mother. She told me I did not belong. A ripple spread through the cabin. Some passengers nodded in agreement. Others raised their phones higher, capturing every second. Megan Rowe's voice broke through, sharp and desperate. That is not true. He was uncooperative. He refused instructions. I was trying to maintain order. The woman across the aisle, who had been recording, stood partway, her phone angled forward. I have it all here. She slapped him. She ripped the letter. No one can deny it. Delgado held up a hand. Ma'am, please remain seated, but we will need that footage. The woman nodded, her voice firm. You can have it, but so can the world. The tension climbed higher. Thomas Grant wiped his forehead, realizing the situation had slipped entirely beyond his control. His authority, once steady, now hung by a thread. At that moment, another passenger stood. He had been quiet until now, a man in his 40s wearing a tailored suit, his briefcase neatly tucked under the seat. His eyes were sharp, and when he spoke, his voice carried both confidence and authority. My name is Samuel Price, he said. I am an attorney. I witnessed the entire incident. I will provide my testimony, and I will also represent this child if necessary. The cabin stirred with fresh energy. Whispers rose. An attorney on board meant the stakes had just escalated. Megan's face paled. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, knowing the weight of law was now pressing against them. Officer Riley stepped forward, her voice calm but direct. Mr. Price, thank you. Please remain available as we collect statements. She turned to Julian, her expression softening. You did nothing wrong. You are safe here. Julian met her eyes. He wanted to believe her words, but a part of him still felt the sting of humiliation, the isolation of being doubted by so many. Yet hearing Samuel Price speak for him gave him a new sense of strength. He was no longer alone. Megan tried again, her voice trembling with frustration. You are all taking the word of a child. This is absurd. He should have been moved to economy until verification was complete. Samuel's reply was sharp, each word measured. What is absurd is striking a child and then attempting to justify it. What is absurd is tearing apart a personal letter as though it were contraband. What is absurd is pretending procedure allows cruelty. The passengers murmured their agreement. Megan's voice faltered, her arguments unraveling under the weight of so many eyes and so much evidence. Julian stayed silent, his breathing steady. His father's lessons echoed in his mind. Sometimes silence carries more power than argument. Tonight, that silence was speaking louder than Megan's protests. Delgado spoke firmly. Ms. Rowe, you will step aside while we complete this investigation. You may not continue your duties on this flight. Megan stiffened. You cannot remove me. I am senior crew. Riley's voice cut through with authority. You assaulted a passenger. Seniority does not excuse misconduct. Please stand and accompany us. For a moment, Megan looked as if she might resist, but the tide had turned too far. The eyes of the passengers, the presence of officers, the recordings of phones, and the voice of an attorney had closed every path of escape. Slowly, reluctantly, she moved into the aisle. As she passed, Julian sat unmoving. He did not gloat. He did not smirk. He simply held her gaze for a heartbeat, his calm expression saying more than words ever could. Megan faltered under his stare, then looked away quickly. The officers guided her toward the galley. The tension eased, though only slightly. The storm had not ended. It had only shifted. Thomas tried to reassert control, his voice shaking. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. This will be resolved shortly. But the passengers were no longer listening to him. Their loyalty had shifted. They spoke quietly to one another, sharing disbelief, outrage, even admiration for the boy who had sat still in the storm. Samuel leaned slightly toward Julian, lowering his voice. "You handled yourself with more dignity than many grown men I have known. Remember that." Julian gave a small nod. He felt gratitude, though he did not speak it aloud. His silence was still his shield. The cabin door opened again. 2 additional officers boarded, speaking quickly with Delgado and Riley. There was talk of statements, reports, verification. The process had begun. A slow machinery of accountability set into motion. Julian closed his eyes for a moment, feeling exhaustion seep into his bones. He had endured the slaps, the humiliation, the doubt. Now others were carrying the burden, voices rising in his defense, professionals stepping in to handle what he could not. He let himself breathe, deeply and evenly, reminding himself that he had not surrendered. Still, questions gnawed at him. Would this have happened if he were someone else's son? Would justice move this swiftly without the invisible power behind his name? He did not know the answers, but the questions would not leave him. The plane remained grounded, but something greater than travel had taken flight. The story of what had happened was already spreading, carried in the pockets of passengers whose recordings would reach far beyond this cabin. Julian sat in 2A, silent but resolute, his presence now a symbol of resistance. He did not need to shout. Others would shout for him, and in the quiet of his own heart, he knew the storm was far from over. The tension in the cabin did not vanish with Megan Rowe's removal. It lingered, heavy as storm clouds that refused to clear even after lightning strikes. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering to one another, glancing at Julian Carter as though he were no longer just a boy in 2A, but the center of something larger. Julian sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees. He had not spoken since Megan was led away. The calm in his posture made him appear older than 11, as if he carried years of experience compressed into his small frame. But inside, his chest tightened. He felt the sting on his cheek, the ache of humiliation, and the quiet burn of questions he did not yet have answers for. Officer Delgado remained close by, conferring quietly with Officer Riley. Their radios crackled with updates from the gate. Thomas Grant tried to stand tall, though his authority had been gutted. He murmured into his headset, his face pale, as he received instructions he could not control. The passengers waited, restless. Some pulled out their phones again, checking social feeds, whispering that the video was already spreading. The woman across the aisle leaned toward Julian. Her voice was soft. "People are seeing this already. You are not alone." Julian gave her a faint nod. He wanted to believe her, but the part of him that had endured the slap, the torn letter, and the doubt still wondered if justice only came because others were watching. Then the watch on his wrist vibrated. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Julian knew the signal well. His father had explained it to him once, late at night in the quiet of their study. "If you ever need me, no matter where I am, you send this signal, and I will move mountains to reach you." Julian lowered his gaze, heart pounding. The vibrations came in a sequence that confirmed the message had been received. His father knew. Help was not only on the way, it was already here. Officer Delgado's radio crackled again, this time with urgency. He listened, frowned, then turned toward Thomas. "We've been asked to pause any removal of passengers. External parties are stepping in." Thomas blinked. "What parties?" Before Delgado could answer, the cabin door opened once more. 2 figures stepped in, their suits crisp, their demeanor unmistakable. Federal aviation officials. Their presence sent a murmur of shock through the cabin. It was not common for regulators to board an aircraft mid-incident. They moved with purpose, greeting Delgado quietly before turning their attention to Julian. One of them A tall man with silver hair crouched slightly to meet Julian's gaze. "Julian Carter?" he asked gently. Julian nodded, his throat suddenly dry. The official's voice softened further. "Your father has been contacted. He wants you to know he is aware of everything. You are safe. We are here to ensure that—" The words rippled through the cabin like a spark through dry grass. Passengers sat straighter, eyes widening, whispers growing louder. The name Carter carried weight. Everyone knew Darius Carter, billionaire, innovator, a man who held entire industries in his hand. Thomas paled visibly, his lips parting in disbelief. He had heard the name, and he understood instantly what it meant. The boy in 2A was not simply a passenger. He was the son of a man whose influence stretched into the very systems that kept this airline alive. Samuel Price, seated only a row away, exhaled slowly, his sharp eyes flicking from Julian to the stunned supervisor. His lips curled into a faint smile. "Well," he murmured, "that changes everything." The murmurs of passengers turned into open conversation. Did they say Carter? Someone whispered. As in the Carter group, another added. That's his son. Julian sat still, his expression composed. He had not wanted this moment. He had wanted to stand on his own, to be defended for who he was rather than whose name he carried. Yet he felt a wave of relief crash against his chest. The silent signal had done its work. His father was now part of this battle. Officer Riley leaned closer to Julian, her voice quiet enough for only him to hear. "We will protect you. You do not have to be afraid anymore." Julian nodded faintly, though inside he wondered, was he safe because he was Julian Carter, or because he was Darius Carter's son? The question gnawed at him, and he knew it would follow him long after this flight. Thomas stammered, his voice breaking. I was not aware." Samuel Price stood, his voice cutting through the confusion. "Awareness is no excuse. A child was assaulted, humiliated, and demeaned. That remains true no matter his last name." The cabin erupted in agreement. Some passengers applauded quietly, others muttered support. The tide had shifted fully. Delgado straightened, his voice steady. "This matter will be investigated at the highest level. The crew members involved are already being suspended pending inquiry." The silver-haired official nodded. "This airline will face accountability." Julian inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He felt the warmth of power surrounding him now, the kind that came not from his own defiance but from the reach of his father's name. It was a complicated warmth, equal parts comfort and weight. He closed his eyes for a moment, retreating inward. He thought of his mother's torn letter, of the gentle words she had written. Those words had not depended on his father's name, only on her belief in him. "Hold your head high. Call me when you land. Remember who you are," he whispered silently to himself. "I remember." When he opened his eyes, he found Samuel watching him closely. The lawyer's expression was thoughtful, almost protective. "You did more than hold your ground," Samuel said softly. "You showed everyone what dignity looks like under fire." Julian offered a small nod. He wanted to believe it. Yet beneath the praise, the questions still stirred. The cabin lights flickered softly. Outside the windows, the airport tarmac gleamed under floodlights, silent witnesses to the storm inside. The aircraft had not moved in nearly an hour, but no one seemed impatient anymore. They were waiting, not for a flight, but for justice. The revelation had changed the air. Julian Carter was no longer invisible, no longer doubted. His name had shifted the weight of the system. Yet as he sat in 2A, shoulders straight, eyes calm, he knew the real measure was not the name itself, but the way he had refused to move even before it was revealed. And in that truth, he found his strength again. The aircraft sat motionless on the tarmac, engines humming at low idle, its nose pointed toward a runway it would not reach for some time. From the windows, passengers could see the glow of floodlights painting long shadows across the concrete. Trucks idled nearby, waiting for clearance that would not come until the storm inside was resolved. Julian Carter remained in seat 2A, hands resting lightly in his lap, his posture straight despite the exhaustion that crept into his small frame. His cheek still bore a faint red mark, but his eyes held steady. The reveal of his identity had rippled through the cabin like a lightning strike. Now the thunder of consequences began to roll. Phones buzzed across the rows. Videos uploaded by passengers were already spreading online. One clip captured the slap, another the torn letter, another Megan Rose's sharp voice telling Julian he did not belong. The woman across the aisle had uploaded her recording to a social feed, and within minutes, comments poured in, thousands of voices joining a chorus of outrage. Unbelievable. Fire her now. Protect that boy. Julian could not see the screens, but he felt the shift. The whispers around him were no longer just about doubt. They carried a sense of reckoning. Passengers leaned toward one another, showing clips, shaking their heads, their voices filled with both anger and sympathy. Thomas Grant stood near the galley, his radio pressed tightly to his ear. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. The words coming through his headset were not the ones he wanted to hear. He knew now that this incident had left the cabin. It was in the world beyond, spreading faster than he could contain. Officer Delgado paced slowly, his hand resting on his belt, his expression grave. Officer Riley remained near Julian, a steady presence, her eyes soft whenever they met his. She had children of her own, and the thought of any of them enduring what Julian had endured gnawed at her. Julian closed his eyes briefly. His heart beat steady now, no longer racing. He had sent the signal, and his father knew. But what stayed with him most was not the thought of power moving in his favor, but the memory of silence breaking. The voices of passengers rising for him. The woman declaring she was a witness, Samuel Price, standing as his defender. Those moments mattered more to Julian than the vibrations of his watch. The intercom clicked on. The captain's voice was calm, deliberate, every syllable chosen with care. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an ongoing matter, we will be returning to the gate. Please remain seated. This flight will not continue until further notice. Groans of inconvenience rose from a few passengers, but they were drowned out by others who nodded with approval. Most understood the weight of what had happened. Some were still in shock that it had escalated so far, that violence had entered a space designed for calm luxury. The aircraft slowly began to taxi back. The movement was slight, but to Julian it felt momentous. The journey he had expected was no longer about reaching a destination. It was about exposing a truth. Samuel Price leaned toward Julian, his voice low. What happens next will not be simple, but you should know something. You did not waver. That matters. People will see that. Julian nodded faintly. His lips parted, and for the first time in a long stretch of silence, he spoke. Would they see me if I were not his son? The question hung heavy between them. Samuel's expression softened. I cannot promise you the world is fair. But tonight, everyone saw a boy who refused to be moved. That is what they will remember. Julian looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the smooth surface of the watch. His father's name had shifted the balance. Yes, but his own choice to sit firm had lit the spark. The thought gave him both comfort and unease. As the plane rolled toward the gate, flashing blue lights appeared outside the windows. Police vehicles lined the tarmac, and more officials waited with stern faces. News of the incident had traveled beyond the airport itself. Reporters had begun to gather, cameras ready. The story was out. Alive. Unstoppable. Inside the cabin, passengers adjusted their belongings, bracing for the attention awaiting them outside. Some whispered about interviews, about being asked to provide their recordings. Others shook their heads in disbelief at how quickly the ordinary had turned extraordinary. Thomas Grant finally lowered his radio, his shoulders slumping. He approached Julian's row slowly, his voice tentative. "Julian, I did not know who you were." Julian looked up at him calmly. His voice was quiet, but it pierced the air. "Would it matter if I were not his son?" Thomas faltered, unable to answer. His silence was louder than any apology he could have offered. The plane reached the gate, the brakes engaging with a soft shudder. The door opened, and a rush of cool night air mixed with the tense atmosphere inside. Uniformed officers stepped aboard, accompanied by airport officials and airline representatives. Their eyes went immediately to Julian, then to Thomas, then to the space where Megan Rowe had stood before being escorted away. One official cleared his throat. "We will be speaking with several of you tonight. Statements are required. This incident has reached federal attention." Murmurs spread. Passengers exchanged glances, realizing the scale of what had unfolded. Some sat straighter, prepared to testify. Others pulled out their phones, already sharing their experiences with friends and family, waiting beyond security. Julian stayed seated, calm, though his mind churned. The world was moving quickly now, spinning beyond his control. He wondered what his father was doing at this very moment, what decisions were being made in boardrooms far from this gate. He wondered if those decisions would bring justice, or simply shield him because of a name. The woman across the aisle leaned closer, her voice soft. "My name is Anna. If you ever need me to speak, I will. I want you to know I'm proud of how you sat there." Julian met her eyes, gratitude flickering across his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. The officers began escorting passengers one by one to take statements. Samuel Price moved confidently, offering his card, asserting his role as attorney. Anna offered her recordings. Others stepped forward, willing to share. Julian remained in 2A, waiting, still as stone. His silence spoke for him now. The red mark on his cheek told the story. The torn scraps of paper at his feet whispered the rest. Outside, cameras flashed as word spread beyond the gate. Reporters asked questions passengers could not yet answer. Headlines formed in real time. Inside, the boy who had endured humiliation sat calmly, aware that the world now knew his name. The airport terminal was no longer a place of ordinary travel. Beyond the glass of the jet bridge, reporters gathered, microphones raised like weapons, cameras flashing in bursts of light. The incident on Horizon Atlantic Flight 317 had spilled far past the cabin walls and onto the national stage. Inside the aircraft, Julian Carter still sat in 2A. His hands rested calmly in his lap, though his mind spun with the chaos unfolding around him. Officers moved in and out, taking statements, collecting recordings. Each time a passenger stepped forward, another thread of truth was woven into a story too large to ignore. Samuel Price remained close, his presence steady. The lawyer spoke with officers, reassured passengers, and occasionally leaned toward Julian with quiet words of support. Anna, the woman across the aisle, sat with her phone clasped tightly, prepared to provide every frame of her recording. Thomas Grant, once composed, now looked hollow. He avoided Julian's gaze, his radio still clipped to his vest, though no one sought his direction. His authority had dissolved under the weight of the truth. Julian's watch vibrated again. He glanced at the sleek black surface, recognizing the pattern. His father had sent another message. This time it was simple. A confirmation. I am with you. Those 4 silent vibrations steadied him. He pictured Darius Carter in some distant office, already moving forces greater than this airport, already making calls that would ripple through boardrooms and newsrooms alike. Yet, Julian's heart carried a complicated weight. He wanted to be defended because he was Julian, not only because he was Darius Carter's son. The cabin door opened once more. A woman in a dark suit entered, her presence commanding immediate attention. Linda Vargas, the CEO of Horizon Atlantic Airlines. Her face was tight, her eyes scanning the scene with a mixture of anger and urgency. Passengers gasped softly, recognizing her. It was rare for a CEO to step directly onto an aircraft in the middle of the night. She walked directly to Julian's row. For a moment she studied him, her expression faltering as she saw the red mark still faint on his cheek. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but audible to all. Julian, I am deeply sorry. What happened to you is unacceptable. Julian met her gaze, his own calm steady. He said nothing. Silence was still his choice, still his strength. Linda turned toward the passengers. This airline does not tolerate misconduct. The individuals responsible have been removed from duty effective immediately. A full investigation is underway, and disciplinary measures will follow. The words were practiced, but they fell short against the weight of what had been seen. A man in row 4 spoke up, his voice sharp. Words are not enough. We all watched it happen. We saw the slap. We saw the letter ripped apart. You cannot erase that with apologies. Another passenger added, it should never have gotten this far. If we had not spoken, would you have believed him? The cabin buzzed with agreement. Linda Vargas stiffened under the barrage of truth. Her authority was not absolute here. The witnesses had their own power. Samuel Price stepped forward, his tone precise. Madam CEO, accountability is not a press release. It is action, and it is systemic. Tonight's events were not a mistake. They were the result of bias and abuse of authority. That requires more than suspension. It requires change. The word struck home. Passengers nodded, murmurs of approval rising. Linda's jaw tightened, but she did not argue. She knew the cameras outside, the recordings inside, and the power of the Carter name left her little room to maneuver. Julian sat quietly through it all, but his thoughts were loud. He wondered what change could come from this. Could a system so large, so practiced in silence, truly be altered by one night and one boy's refusal to stand? Delgado returned with his notepad. Summarizing quickly, we have more than a dozen witness statements, multiple recordings, and physical evidence of injury. This matter will move forward legally. Linda Vargas exhaled, her voice measured. Then Horizon Atlantic will cooperate fully, and we will begin immediate reforms, diversity and bias training, independent oversight of crew conduct, direct reporting channels for passengers. Samuel's gaze sharpened, and public acknowledgement of what happened here, without spin, without excuses. Linda hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Julian's eyes dropped to the scraps of his mother's letters still on the floor. He had left them there deliberately, a quiet reminder of what had been taken. He wanted Linda Vargas to see them, to understand that this was more than a policy violation. It was a wound that reached deeper than procedure. Anna noticed his gaze. She leaned down quietly, gathering the torn pieces in her hands. She placed them gently on Julian's tray table. These are yours, she whispered. Julian looked at her, gratitude flickering in his eyes. He touched the torn fragments softly, then folded them back together as best he could. The pieces did not align perfectly, but the words were still legible. Hold your head high. Remember who you are. He whispered the words to himself. Remember who you are. Outside the cabin, the noise of reporters grew louder. Security lined the jet bridge, preparing to escort Julian and others into a waiting area shielded from cameras. Before leaving, Samuel crouched beside him. You changed something tonight, he said quietly. Not because of your father's name, because you sat here and refused to move. Julian nodded faintly. He wanted to believe it, but he also knew the world would see him as both, the boy in 2A and the son of Darius Carter. Linda Vargas straightened, her face firm. We will face this openly, I promise you that. For the first time, Julian spoke directly to her. His voice was soft but steady. Do not promise me. Promise everyone. Her lips parted, her eyes softening. She gave a small nod. The officers began guiding passengers toward the exit, preparing them for questioning. Samuel walked close to Julian, Anna just behind, the fragments of the letter still in his possession. As they stepped off the plane, the flash of cameras spilled into the cabin, hungry and relentless. Officers blocked the view, shielding Julian as best they could. But the story was already out, already beyond their control. Julian walked quietly, shoulders straight, his silence still his shield. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply moved forward, aware that tonight the system itself was on trial, and that his calm defiance had lit the first spark. Weeks later, the storm that had begun in the first-class cabin of Horizon Atlantic Flight 317 had spread far beyond the airport. What started with a slap and a torn letter had become a national conversation. Videos from passengers had flooded every platform, sparking outrage, debate, and calls for accountability. For many, the face of that conversation was not a CEO, not an attorney, not even the airline itself. It was the quiet, steady image of an 11-year-old boy who refused to leave his seat. Julian Carter now found himself in a place he had only seen on television. The Grand Chamber of Congress stretched above him, its tall windows casting beams of light across polished wood. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens ready, cameras positioned to capture every angle. Senators sat in rows, their voices hushed as they prepared for testimony. Julian sat at a long table, a glass of water in front of him, the torn pieces of his mother's letter folded neatly in his jacket pocket. Beside him sat Samuel Price, his steady presence a shield. On Julian's other side, his father Darius sat with quiet strength, not as the powerful CEO the world knew, but as a father supporting his son. The chairwoman of the committee adjusted her microphone. This hearing is called to order. We are here to examine systemic misconduct within airline operations and the events surrounding Horizon Atlantic Flight 317. Today, we hear from a key witness. She turned her gaze toward Julian. Young man, please state your name for the record. Julian's heart thudded in his chest. He swallowed once, then spoke clearly. My name is Julian Carter. The room hushed further. Every word he spoke carried weight, not because of who his father was, but because of the strength in his voice. The chairwoman nodded. Julian, you may tell us, in your own words, what happened to you. Julian drew a breath. He remembered his father's advice: tell the truth, simply and calmly. He placed his small hands on the table, fingers steady. I was sitting in seat 2A, the seat printed on my ticket. A flight attendant accused me of not belonging. When I told her I would not move, she slapped me. Later, she tore a letter from my mother. When I stayed in my seat, she struck me again. Gasps echoed faintly through the room, even though the details were already public. Hearing them in his own words was different. Raw, human, Julian continued, his voice still even. She told me I did not belong there, but I knew I did. I stayed. Silence followed, the kind that pressed against the walls and made every listener feel its weight. One senator leaned forward. Julian, how did you remain calm in that moment? Julian hesitated. His voice softened, but it carried. My parents always told me that dignity is something no one can take from you unless you give it away. I remembered that, even when she hit me, even when she tore my letter. I wanted to keep my dignity. The chairwoman's eyes softened. And you did. Samuel placed a supportive hand near Julian's arm, but did not interrupt. He knew the boy was carrying his own story, and his silence between words was as powerful as his testimony. Another senator asked, Julian, what do you want to see change after what happened? Julian reached into his pocket and unfolded the torn pieces of paper. He placed them gently on the table. The fragments of his mother's handwriting faced the committee. I want this never to happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. I want crews to know that every passenger deserves respect. And I want children, especially children who look like me, to know they belong. The chamber stirred. The sight of the boy with torn paper in front of him struck deeper than any chart or policy report. Darius Carter finally spoke, his voice steady, resonant. My son's strength brought us here. But the truth is bigger than him. It is about how systems fail when prejudice is allowed to operate unchecked. Tonight we are talking about one flight, one slap, one torn letter. Tomorrow it could be another child. That is why this system must change. The senators nodded gravely. The chairwoman tapped her pen lightly against her notes. This committee will hold Horizon Atlantic accountable, and we will examine industry-wide reforms, training, oversight, independent review boards. This case is not only about an individual, but about the culture that allowed this to happen. Julian sat quietly, letting the words wash over him. He did not crave the spotlight, yet he knew his presence was necessary. His silence had begun the conversation. Now his voice carried it forward. Reporters scribbled furiously. Some wiped their eyes. In the gallery, spectators whispered to one another. He's only 11, someone said, and he's braver than half this room. Julian folded the letter fragments back into his pocket. They would always be imperfect, edges jagged, but he kept them as a reminder. Pain could not be erased, but it could be carried with dignity. When the hearing ended, the chairwoman addressed him directly. Julian, thank you. Your testimony will guide this work. You have shown us what courage looks like. Julian rose slowly, flanked by Samuel and his father. As he stepped away from the table, cameras flashed, questions shouted, but he kept his gaze steady. His silence between each step was louder than the noise around him. Outside the chamber, sunlight spilled through the marble corridors. Reporters pressed forward, but security held them back. Samuel leaned close to Julian. You gave them more than words today. You gave them truth. Julian nodded. He felt both exhausted and lighter, as though speaking had released something he had carried since that night on the plane. Yet, deep inside, he wondered if the system would truly change. Would his testimony spark reform, or would it become another story lost in the noise? His father seemed to sense the question. Darius rested a hand on Julian's shoulder. Real change is not instant. It is built, piece by piece. Tonight, you gave them the first piece. Julian looked up at him. Even if I was only heard because of you, Darius's expression softened. You were heard because of who you are. My name opened doors, yes, but your strength kept them open. Julian let the words settle. For the first time, he began to believe them. That night, news outlets across the country carried the story of the boy who spoke before Congress. Clips of his testimony spread online. Millions of views within hours. Commentators debated policy, activists called for reform, and ordinary people whispered to their children about courage. And in a quiet room far from the cameras, Julian sat with his parents. He unfolded the torn letter once more, smoothing the pieces on the table. Together, they read the words aloud. Hold your head high. Remember who you are. Julian smiled faintly. I think I did. The weeks that followed Julian Carter's testimony carried the momentum of a tidal wave. Headlines filled every screen. Editorials demanded accountability. Advocacy groups pushed for sweeping change. Horizon Atlantic, once known only as a luxury carrier, had become a symbol of reckoning. For Julian, life did not return to ordinary. Strangers recognized him in grocery stores, in parks, in airports. Some approached with gratitude, thanking him for his courage. Others simply looked at him with quiet admiration, as though his silence on that plane had spoken to something deep inside them. At home, the Carter residence became a hub of activity. Reporters called constantly. Advocacy groups sent invitations, and legal teams drafted proposals. Yet his parents shielded him where they could. Elaine Carter reminded him daily that he was still a child, deserving of moments of normalcy. Darius Carter worked late nights, but each evening he returned to sit with Julian, often without words, simply offering his presence. The airline itself moved quickly under scrutiny. Linda Vargas, under immense pressure, announced sweeping reforms. Horizon Atlantic launched independent oversight boards, implemented real-time passenger grievance channels, and introduced mandatory training focused on bias and de-escalation. Megan Rowe was terminated, her actions condemned not just as misconduct, but as a violation of the airline's duty to protect passengers. Thomas Grant resigned quietly. His career ended not with ceremony, but with silence. But the change did not stop there. Other airlines, fearful of similar scandal, began announcing reforms of their own. Congressional hearings transformed into proposed legislation requiring industry-wide accountability. For the first time, it seemed as though systemic injustice within the skies might truly be confronted. Julian followed the developments with cautious curiosity. He read articles when they came across the kitchen counter, listened to snippets of news while his parents cooked dinner. He understood the weight of what had happened, but he also wrestled with questions that lingered. Would the world have listened if he were not a Carter? Would his silence have carried the same power without cameras? These doubts shadowed his triumph, but they did not erase it. One evening, Samuel Price visited their home. He carried a small folder and a warm smile. "Julian," he said as he sat across from him at the dining table, "I have something for you." He opened the folder to reveal a certificate, the creation of the Julian Carter Foundation, seeded by donations from passengers and matched by Horizon Atlantic itself. The fund would provide scholarships for young travelers in underrepresented communities, ensuring children could see the world without fear of discrimination. Julian touched the paper softly, his eyes widening. "For me, for you," Samuel said, "because your courage created this, and because dignity should always be met with opportunity." Elaine wiped her eyes quietly. Darius placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. Julian felt the warmth spread through him. The letter from his mother, still torn but carefully preserved in a frame on his desk, seemed to glow in his memory. Its words echoed again. "Hold your head high. Remember who you are." Months later, Julian returned to the skies. This time, he boarded quietly with his parents, the world watching less intently, but the weight of change still present. Flight attendants greeted him with visible care. Passengers glanced at him with recognition, but Julian focused only on the seat before him. He sat down, fastening his belt, his small hands calm in his lap. As the plane lifted into the clouds, Julian looked out the window. He did not think of fear. He thought of the thousands of children who might fly safer because of one night, one refusal, one silent strength. He thought of Anna's recording, Samuel's defense, his father's support, and his mother's letter, all pieces of a story that was now larger than himself. When the plane leveled at cruising altitude, Julian closed his eyes. He was no longer only the boy in 2A. He was a reminder, a spark, a voice carried further than he had ever imagined, and though questions would remain about power, about privilege, about justice, he knew he had lived one truth fully. Even under fire, dignity could not be taken. Years later, long after the hearings and headlines, passengers would still whisper about the boy who sat still in his seat, who endured slaps and humiliation and yet refused to rise. His silence had become a language of defiance, and his voice before Congress had become a call for reform. Julian Carter's name would be written into policy documents, into speeches, into the quiet hearts of children told they did not belong, and each time his story would remind them otherwise. Hold your head high. Remember who you are. That was his legacy. And so, from the cabin of one flight to the halls of Congress, Julian Carter's story became more than just a boy's ordeal. It became a mirror reflecting the biases still hidden in plain sight, and a call to confront injustice wherever it rises. His silence in seat 2A became a voice for millions, a reminder that dignity is not a privilege, but a right. We are left with questions that linger long after the engines quiet. How many others have been silenced without cameras to capture their truth? How many more will it take before equality is not debated but lived? What Julian endured is heartbreaking, but what he showed us is unforgettable. Strength without shouting, courage without cruelty, a child reminding adults of what humanity truly means. Let his story stir compassion in us, respect for every traveler, and a firm rejection of discrimination in any form. And let it leave you waiting, because this is not the end. It is only the beginning of stories we must continue to tell. If this touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can walk with us through the stories that demand to be heard.